From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefanía Bravo, and this is From the South. A succession of Caribbean leaders have delivered impassioned speeches at the UN. They challenged the global organization to take account all of countries, whatever their size or wealth. Barbados PM Mia Motley waded into the global bloc for failing to protect small member states. She says Caribbean countries will no longer be ignored or sidelined.
We in the Caribbean need the world to look again, and in the Pacific to look again at a commitment of 1.5 degree change, because 2 degrees is calamitous. We need dedicated financing for development in the Addis Ababa Action Plan that speaks to small island developing states. We need the world to recognize that that graph that showed the tipping points cannot reinforce in us our greatest fear, that the world believes that we are dispensable.
She says natural disasters and economic crisis have destabilized these countries. In fact, this reality hit close to home for Prime Minister Motley, as Barbados is still recovering from the effects of Tropical Storm Kirk.
I leave here to cut short my trip to go home to my country. Some may say that in spite of the flooding, we were lucky that Tropical Storm Kirk did not do greater damage. 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, it was Isaac. I say simply that we cannot plan our affairs or that of our people on the basis of luck. It must be on the basis of policy and decisive action, but above all else, on the basis of caring and empathy. I ask the world to pause, and let us get this one right.
And Antigua and Barbuda Prime Minister Gaston Brown also addressed world leaders. He called for a reinvigorated United Nations. Prime Minister Brown says the UN must not be seen as a talking shop which fails to deliver on its promises. It must be made relevant.
Year after year, a few privileged nations are making decisions that impact the livelihood of billions. The exclusive clubs of the G7 and the G20 cannot repair the fragmented international financial system without taking full account of the circumstances and views of the majority of the world's nations. Nor can the Commission of the European Union, which now seeks to impose its own anti-competition high tax policies on developing countries around the world.
He also took aim at powerful nations who impose high tax policies, threats, and sanctions on other states.
Arbitrary rules set by unrepresentative bodies for their own narrow purposes have no legitimacy in the world. Enforcement of those arbitrary rules by threat and sanctions of the mighty is not legitimate. I hereby make the call once again for a reinvigorated and relevant United Nations General Assembly.
Meanwhile, Antigua and Barbuda is still awaiting a multi-million-dollar financial settlement in a long-running dispute with the United States. The U.S. owes Antigua for U.S. measures against online gambling that harmed the island's economy. Prime Minister Brown lamented the situation at the UN debate.
After 15 years of winning an arbitration at the WTO, my little country is still awaiting an acceptable settlement by the United States to honor its obligation to us. That's right, 15 years later, we're still waiting. The U.S. economy is 20,000 times larger than Antigua and Barbuda's. Compensation for the injury to my small country is less than 0.008% of 1 year of the U.S.'s GDP.
And now we are being joined by our correspondent in Bridgetown, Kareem Smith, who will expand on Prime Minister Motley's UN contribution. Hi, Kareem. Thank you for joining us. We've heard quite a passionate speech from Prime Minister Motley covering a range of issues affecting Barbados and, by extension, the Caribbean. What's your take on it?
Okay, well, for people here in Barbados, it is definitely very good to see a new Prime Minister taking a very distinct posture as it relates to the international community, and where she focused on the issue of climate change. For us here in Barbados, that is extremely important, given that it has just hit home with Tropical Storm Kirk, a very, very weak system that has caused a bunch of flooding here in Barbados last year. You had Maria in Dominica, you had Irma in Antigua, and really, as she rightfully said, it's not a matter of profits, but this is a matter of life and death. And it seems to be an issue that continues to be shrugged under the carpet as such, and an issue that needs to be addressed to a greater extent by the international community, and a very, very strong call. She makes no words. And I think that that type of leadership is the type of leadership that we need from Caribbean nations and from small island developing states when we approach the international community.
The Prime Minister also touched on the flooding situation in Barbados. What is the situation like for you at this moment weather-wise?
Okay, well, it's a lot better than it was last night and early this morning. We're getting word that Tropical Storm Kirk is moving away from Barbados, and that is reflected in our skies. It's a bit overcast, but there's no rain right now. Of course, there's still people in the south of the country that are still recovering, people who are currently sweeping water from their homes and bucketing water out of their homes in certain areas. There are people who, at the last opportunity that I had to check, were saying that they still couldn't exactly leave their homes. It's not a life-threatening situation, and we're very thankful for that. No lives have been lost here in Barbados, but as you can always see with these systems, it can easily become a matter of life and death when these tropical cyclones hit places that are so low-lying and so tropical.
Kareem, thank you so much for your time. We have been speaking with Kareem Smith, our correspondent in Bridgetown. And now we go live to our correspondent, Gemma Handy in St. John's, who has been listening closely to Prime Minister Gaston Brown's speech. Hello, Gemma. What do you think were the most important points in what we just heard from Gaston Brown?
Well, following the Bahamian and the think leaders, he came across quite controversial. He had some very strong words about the UN General Assembly. Lots of Caribbean leaders tend to subdue issues of more pertinent to their country. He had people talking about the sargassum, but Prime Minister Brown, he hit out at the UN. He was quite statesmanlike. He said that the General Assembly's aim was for a pathway to universal peace, but that eludes us all, and people had long stopped caring what was said here. He talked on, unsurprisingly, he usually does, about the ongoing spat with the United States with regards to the World Trade Organization ruling. It has never reached what he described as a reasonable settlement for Antigua and Barbuda. He pointed out the US economy was 20,000 times larger than Antigua and Barbuda, and the WTO was powerless to enforce its own awards, which meant Antigua and Barbuda was helpless to do so on its own. He also urged all countries to come to a table of dialogue. This is a shared planet, he says, and our common humanity depends upon it.
Gemma, what did he say about climate change?
He said that the worst emitters fail to own up to climate change. He said the impact on the Caribbean is increased hurricanes. Of course, we saw that last year. That has a knock-on effect on people's home insurance, commercial insurance, of course, national debt as well. He said the damage caused in last year by hurricanes topped $150 billion US. Less than half of Barbuda, which also was devastated by Barbuda, had yet been delivered. So some very strong words at the Assembly this afternoon.
Gemma, thank you so much for your time. We have speaking with Gemma Handy in St. John's. More stories now. As the debates continued, St. Kitts and Nevis Prime Minister Timothy Harris turned his attention to the issue of climate change. He says it has adversely affected the Caribbean and presents an existential threat to its people. He therefore pleads for environmental intervention and assistance from UN members.
Assembly. The damage the OECS sub-region sustained last year from Hurricanes Irma and Maria was unimaginable. The United Nations High-Level Pledging Conference in the aftermath of these hurricanes was an attempt to chart the way forward in creating resilience and building back better. We ask that the member states with outstanding commitments deal with these as soon as practicable.
He also called for an end to what he described as the UN's discriminatory policies and preferential treatment, which affect smaller UN member states. St. Kitts and Nevis is the smallest country in the Western Hemisphere.
The international community cannot, on one hand, claim to help SIDS, while in the same vein, classify us as middle and high-income countries based on archaic financial models that ultimately deny access to critical developmental assistance and hinder investment financing. We reiterate our calls for the international community to address with urgency the sterile measure of per capita income now employed.
And earlier on, while speaking at the UN General Assembly, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia made a plea for debt relief in the face of climate change.
St. Lucia remains economically vulnerable to de-risking and the loss of correspondent banking relations, remain out of the reach of any access to concessionary finance. Our reputations are unfairly tarnished by tax labels. We continue to struggle under the weight of international frameworks that do not provide an enabling environment for my country to chart an effective, sustainable development path, or even to be able to take control of our own destiny.
And earlier in the day, China and Russia took to the podium in New York. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi says his country would not be blackmailed by U.S. tariffs imposed on Chinese goods. He also said China is fully committed to the principles of multilateralism, while the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov criticized some Western countries for taking unilateral actions against other countries.
The financial crisis broke out, China chose not to stand idly by, but to work together with other countries to tide over rough times. For years running, China has contributed over 30% of global growth. It has played its part in helping restore global recovery. In the face of new developments and severe challenges, China will keep to its commitment and remain a champion of multilateralism.
International community has to pay a high price for the parochial, self-serving ambitions of a small group of countries. The collective mechanisms of response to common security challenges have stalled. Diplomacy and the culture of negotiations and compromise have been increasingly replaced by dictates and unilateral extraterritorial restrictions put in effect without the consent of the UN Security Council. Such measures, applied already to dozens of countries, are not only illicit but are also ineffective.
The Colombian guerrillas of the National Liberation Army are accusing President Iván Duque of wrecking the possibilities of peace. A communique from the ELN says Duque has repeatedly put obstacles in the way of restarting peace talks. First, he demanded that the ELN unilaterally cease all its insurgent activity. Now he is trying to remove Venezuela as one of the guarantors of the peace process. All this, it says, is tearing up the progress made in the last 5 years. The ELN calls on Colombian society, social movements, political parties and churches, as well as the Vatican and the international community to keep pushing for peace in Colombia.
If you want to start talking about the role of the guarantors, you have to start by recognizing the contribution these countries have made in the last 7 years, and the commitment they have shown to support the peace process. We haven't abandoned the talks. And we are not going to. We know that Colombia wants to end the conflict, but the other side needs to provide the guarantees for that to happen.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us.
With developing events being presented through analysis. Our coverage transcends borders. With renowned journalist Walter Martinez.
Salud amigos, tripulantes de nuestra querida, contaminada y única nave espacial.
Dossier. Weekdays. Only on Telesur.
Y ponga usted las cámaras, señor director.
Welcome back. Pope Francis has defrogged Chilean priest Fernando Caradima, who is at the center of a sexual abuse scandal. This means the Pope has signed a decree removing Caradima from the priesthood. The 88-year-old priest was convicted of sexually abusing minors in 2011. Due to the statute of limitations in Chile, Caradima managed to escape civil justice. 7 Chilean bishops have resigned since June after inquiries were made into the alleged masking of Caradima's wrongdoings. Another 92 Venezuelans will head back to their country from Ecuador as part of their return to the homeland plan. People are gathering outside the Venezuelan embassy waiting to board the 4th plane bound for Venezuela. The flight is expected to depart sometime on Friday.
I want to congratulate President Maduro for the implementation of this plan because all the Venezuelans who are here have a different stories and unfortunately many of us want to go back. But we don't have the money for it. And now, thanks to President Maduro, I can say that soon I will be in my country.
We came here with many expectations, many of them created by the media, especially the social media. But when we arrived here, we saw that the reality was very different to what was being projected. So when we saw this, we decided it's better to be in our country.
Our correspondent in Quito, Denise Herrera, has more.
Hello, we are outside the Venezuela embassy in Ecuador, where around 92 people will leave Ecuador today under the Return to Homeland plan implemented by the Venezuelan government, implemented by the President Nicolas Maduro after several allegations of xenophobia and labor exploitation were made public in several countries around the region. Now Ecuador is expected to leave, the 4th plane, and these people will come back finally to their country, to Venezuela, and they will come back to their families. So this is all we have for now. Back to you at the studio.
We thank Denise Herrera for that report. Thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against water privatization in the capital of El Salvador. They are demanding that the Legislative Assembly reject a bill that would privatize water. Protesters stand by their declaration that access to water is a human right.
Gathered in Plaza Barrios in San Salvador, thousands of people joined the signature collection campaign. They'll deliver them to the deputies of the National Assembly. They're demanding compliance with the 2nd constitutional amendment that protects access to water as a human right.
The Salvadorian people are tired of the lack of commitment around water legislation. As you know, our country is suffering a grave environmental crisis, a water crisis.
After 2 months without discussing the water bill in the Congress for Environmental and Climate Change, protesters are calling out members of parliament for ignoring the scientific research coming from the country's universities.
The paper hasn't been studied because we talked with some members of the commission and they aren't informed. We presented a study that compares water laws in various countries and we found that there are common perspectives in almost all Latin American countries, that water is a fundamental right.
More than 200 signatures were taken to the parliament. They say that this is the first stage of many collections and rallies to prevent water privatization.
People are participating actively in this country's democracy, and that's important. It's important to state that the church is also joining the street protests because there's just no other way to establish dialogue with the business groups in El Salvador.
To approve the water law means that the state would manage the majority of water resources and not the private sector. This would be a permanent fight for the people for the right to access to water.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this.
ليش انت لاجئ؟ لا نحن بلد استقبلنا لاجئين كثير ونعرف شو معنات اللاجئ بس ما عشناه لحتى اجى اليوم وبلشت الحرب.
او خلقي كشر دروز دكا بس بفكر لمندالي خوي كمندالي بمرض تسيل يدي لابد.
امريكا شو بدها بافغانستان او شو بدها من العراق او شو بدها من سوريا او شو بدها من ليبيا او شو بدها من
Sunday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. The U.S. Senate has voted 11-10 to advance Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination to the full Senate. The vote comes one day after Kavanaugh and the woman who accused him of sexual assault, Christine Blasey Ford, testified before the Judiciary Committee. During the session, Republican Senator Jeff Flake had asked for the vote to be delayed so the FBI could investigate the accusations made against Kavanaugh.
With regard to making sure that we do due diligence here. And I think it would be proper to delay the floor vote for up to, but not more than 1 week, in order to let the FBI continue to do an investigation limited in time and scope.
A huge data breach has compromised accounts of 50 million Facebook users worldwide. The company says hackers were able to exploit a vulnerability in a feature known as FtS to gain control of people's accounts. The breach was discovered on Tuesday, Facebook said, and it has informed the police.
It's our fourth F8.
2 earthquakes have hit Indonesia, leading to a tsunami that swept through the village of Palu. The tsunami brought waves of up to 2 meters in height. Buildings were heavily damaged, and officials say at least 5 people are believed to have died. The first earthquake was of magnitude 7.5, striking the island of Sulawesi. 10 aftershocks have followed so far. At a press conference in Germany, the Turkish president and German chancellor discussed economic relations and the case of an imprisoned journalist. Angela Merkel and Recep Tayyip Erdogan took questions from the press about the jailed journalist in Turkey. Erdogan said some journalists have been released, while some cases are proceeding through the courts. While Merkel announced plans for an upcoming meeting between Turkey, France, and Russia on Syria in October. At least 45 people have been killed by cholera in Zimbabwe in the past 3 weeks. More than 90 cases have also been confirmed so far. Most of the deaths have been in and around the capital Harare, and a quarter of the victims are children. The authorities have launched an oral vaccine campaign to control the outbreak.
This is an outbreak which caught us by surprise, I would say, with a rapid increase of cases. And of course, initially deaths as well.
South Africa's Cape Town is to ease restrictions on the use of water by local residents. Starting from the 1st of October, people will be able to use 70 liters of water instead of 50 per day. A severe drought in 2015 placed a strain on water supplies, prompting authorities to restrict its use. Water saving and rain has raised water levels at local dams, allowing for the limit to be lifted. Wrestlers in Mexico are breaking stereotypes in lucha libre. They have a different size, but the same amount of passion. A show known as Microstars is becoming more and more popular as it breaks with the traditional image of fighters. Their strength and agility has made them the stars of the show. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurtv.net/English. And also join us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.